Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Gerard Henderson, who is an Australian author, columnist and political commentator and executive director of the Sydney Institute. He is also the author of a number of books, including two on B.A. Santamaria, about whom we are talking today. Santamaria, A Most Unusual Man, and Mr. Santamaria and the Bishops. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Gerard.
Thank you, Georgina.
It's wonderful to have you on and to talk about such an important figure in 20th century Australian history and, of course, a lovely Menzies connection as well. Someone you obviously have followed both in career and in thought and in your published work. So I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation.
Fine.
Gerard, I wondered if we could start off by discussing B.A. Santamaria's Italian immigrant background and how important that was to his identity and worldview.
Well, B.A. Santamaria, Bartholomew Augustine, but people called him Bob, was born in 1915 as the eldest child, and both of his parents were born in the Aeolian Islands, or part of Italy, but off the mainland of Italy. And they came to Australia separately, met in Australia, married, and Bob was the first born in 1915. Originally, they ran what would some years ago be called a greengrocer's shop in Sydney Road, Brunswick, where Santamaria was born. And it was a very small shop. They had the shop downstairs. They had the accommodation upstairs. His mother wasn't quite sure what to do with Bob because he's a pretty lively kid, as I understand it. So he went to school very early. He went around the corner of a Catholic primary school, not far from the Catholic parish church. So he was at school at a young age, and so he graduated from secondary school at a young age, and he entered Melbourne University at a young age, where he studied arts and law, graduated in arts and graduated in law. Now, his background was Italian, but of course, when he was at school with kids in the local part of Brunswick, which before it was taken over by left-wing sandal wearers some time ago, was from 1915, was very much a working-class suburb. People in Australian rules would understand that Sydney Road, Brunswick's not far from the Carlton football ground. Santamaria became a very strong supporter of Carlton, as did his father. So he grew up in an Australian environment of the time, essentially children of Irish Catholic background and teachers and the local priest of Irish Catholic background primarily, but among others as well. And, of course, a lot of the kids he went to school with, they had Australian-born parents, some had Australian-born grandparents. So he comes up in that environment where he's very much out on his own. In my book, Santamaria, A Most Unusual Man, I managed to get a copy of him in early secondary school, and he's quite visible as the only Italian boy or the only non-Anglo-Celtic boy among a group of about 30. So he stood out as that, or he didn't stand high. He was always quite short, but he was sitting on the ground, I think, and no one sort of noticed as the others stood behind him. And there was a row on the ground and then the others. So that was his background. He grew up in the Catholic faith, which he never lost. But his parents, I think his father didn't go to Mass. Most Italian men didn't go to Mass at that stage. His mother may have, but he was connected with the local Catholic church in Brunswick. And they moved around that area while he was young. And then later on, he moved to the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where he stayed and where he died. He lived in Balwyn, and he lived in Kew, and he lived in North Balwyn. But as a young man, he lived in a city, Melbourne, around the Sydney Road area.
Was it unusual for someone like B.A. Santamaria to attend university? I presume it was. It was certainly unusual for Robert Menzies to attend university from 1913 to 18. He had to go for scholarships in order to be able to enter university.
Well, it was very unusual. Well, as you know, as you were saying, it's very unusual for anyone to attend university in those days. Daniel Mannix, the Irish-born Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, who came to Australia in 1913 and became Archbishop in 1917. He was a well-educated Irishman who'd run Maynooth College, which was then a seminary, is now a university in Ireland. And Mannix was determined that the Catholics in Australia would make their way up in society and be properly educated. Now, Mannix was very upset when he came to Australia because he was a prominent Irish nationalist, But he'd always been treated very well by the British establishment around Dublin Castle. They treated the leaders of the Catholic Church very well. But Mannix found that when he came to Australia, the Catholics were treated much worse in Australia, and he lived in Melbourne, of course, than were the Catholics of his rank in Dublin, even though you had British rule in Dublin, because there were a lot of Protestant Irishmen, and they were mainly men in Melbourne. A lot were clergymen. And Melbourne had a very strong anti-Catholic sectarian feel at the time. So Mannix decided that young people should get educated. What he did was they brought about a situation where the most promising students in the Catholic secondary system, and Santamaria after his primary school went to Christian Brothers School in North Melbourne, the top performing boys, and there were boys from those boys' schools, would go to what was then called St Kevin's in East Melbourne, and St Kevin's would be the scholarship school. And so from there they would win scholarships to university. And Bob Santamaria did that. And, of course, one of his friends at school was Jim McClelland, who later became an industrial lawyer and a minister in Gough Whitlam's Labor government, one of the few good ministers in Gough Whitlam's Labor government. He only got in towards the end. So that group of young boys like Santamaria and McClelland, they went off to Melbourne University, and from there they went on. And so there was a whole... Mannix was quite a bit different from the Catholic Church in Sydney, but the Catholic Church in Melbourne, the whole aim of the church was to educate all boys and girls, but particularly men, boys who became men who went in to go into the professions, and it sort of worked. So Santamaria was an example of the stress that Mannix put on Catholic education. But of course, Mannix didn't do it all with himself. He had the religious sisters who worked for nothing. He had the religious brothers who worked for nothing. And there were some priests like the Jesuits who were priests who also taught in schools for nothing. And they produced a whole generation of young men, which continued into my generation as well.
B.A. Santamaria reflect much on any racism he experienced, though, growing up? Because, as you say, he's in these classrooms. You say the school photo of him at St Kevin's. He's the only one of Italian background. Everyone else is, I guess, Anglo-Irish background. How did that influence his worldview? Did that give him a unique perspective, or was he pervious to that?
Well, I'll come back to that. I mean, I'm talking Anglo-Celtic. Anglo-Irish were the Protestant Irish. I'm talking Anglo-Celtic. So that is children of British or Irish background. I mean, my background's a bit of both. I have a maternal grandmother born in Ireland and a paternal grandfather born in Glasgow. So we're talking about the Anglo-Celtics. Well, it's interesting. Later on, when the multicultural debate came up, Santamaria said that this was all exaggerated and there wasn't a problem of any kind with race in Australia. But when I trace back what he wrote earlier, as a young man, he didn't like the term being used against him of a dago. He found that very offensive. There was a term that a lot of Italians were called dagos at the time, and he found that when he was young, he said that was offensive. As he got older, he said it didn't happen.
Did that have a particular meaning, that word? Did it, or is it just a...
I just meant you were from it. Just meant you were from Italy.
Right.
Or your parents were.
Yeah.
Because there weren't many people of European background that wasn't British or Irish, it wasn't Anglo-Celtic background. And when he took part in the famous debate on this, which was famous for its time, it got wide coverage in the newspapers at Melbourne University on the Spanish Civil War in 1937. I mean, someone yelled out to him about Spain. He said, why don't you go back to Spain? And his answer, because I didn't come from there. And he was born in Brunswick after all. But I think he actually presented himself as a bit Spanish in the Spanish Civil War debate for effect. He was a bit like that. He was a polemicist all his life, and he was a bit devious with things at times. But when I knew him, and I knew him well for 10 years between 1965 and 1975, he didn't talk about that much at all. But there would have been a bit of that around. But on the other hand, I mean, his father worked in well with the local community in Brunswick. Bob Santamaria always presented him as someone who was a greengrocer, which he was, but he also went into liquor. He had some liquor stores later on Brunswick Road, Sydney, and he was also quite a gambler. There was a suggestion he was into illegal, what was called SP, starting price bookmaking. He may have been. I just raised that in the book. I don't know. But his father mixed very well in the local community. And I think from what I can read of it, I mean, those of us of Italian and different background and in the Catholic community in Brunswick where he mixed got on pretty well. And you've got to remember here that it's important that that group of Catholics of Santamaria's time and later on as well, I mean, when they looked overseas, they didn't look to the Queen in London, in Buckingham Palace. They looked to the Pope in Rome.
Yeah.
And the Pope in Rome in those days, and for a long time before and for some time after, they were Italian. So in other words, the Pope was a dago, you see. I mean, the Catholics had a different kind of attitude because they were a minority at the time. So were the Jews and to some extent a few Germans, mainly in South Australia and Western Victoria. They were minorities. So if you were Italian in Catholic school in Brunswick, I mean, you were Italian, but so was the Pope. So it wasn't much of a put down.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think they pretty well got on okay together. He didn't. I mean, Australia at that time, as it remained, was a pretty tolerant society. I mean, in the First World War, Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, used anti-Catholic sectarianism against Daniel Mannix because he thought Mannix was a powerful player in the anti-conscription cause, and he was in the second plebiscite of 1917, not so much the first plebiscite of 1916. And that attitude of anti-Catholic sectarianism prevailed until at least the Second World War and a little bit after. But even so, people got along pretty well. I mean, people weren't burning down people's property. I mean, there were no assaults in the street. I mean, there was a degree of anti-Catholic sectarianism, and there was a degree of opposition to minorities, who were mainly the Italians around that part of Melbourne. But, I mean, it wasn't all that dramatic. There was very little ethnic-motivated crime. So I think it was a pretty tolerant society then, and I think it's judged by the standards of the time, and I think it's a pretty tolerant society today.
Gerard, is there any reason why Melbourne was more sectarian than other parts of Australia? Was it just because there were more Catholics in Melbourne and so that was more of a phenomenon?
Yes, I think that's
the answer. In
answer.
Adelaide, there wasn't such a strong Catholic community, clearly.
No, the Catholic community in South Australia and Tasmania was small, was relatively small in Queensland. It was strong in New South Wales and Victoria, but New South Wales was much more a Labor state. It's not so much these days, but that was partly because of the predominance of Newcastle to the north of Sydney, Sydney and Wollongong. And so therefore in New South Wales, you had a lot of Labor governments through the early part of the 20th century. But in Victoria, you didn't have a standalone Labor government until the early 1950s. You had a couple of minority Labor governments. So in other words, Catholics were very close to the centre of power or the centre of government in New South Wales, but they weren't in Victoria because most voted Labor and Labor was invariably in opposition. I think that's the prime reason. The other reason is I think a number of anti-Catholic sectarian Protestant clergymen, particularly of the Congregational and Presbyterian faith, ended up in Melbourne, although Mannix became friendly with some of those later on. So I think it's a combination of reasons, but I think it's mainly the fact that Melbourne was dominated by what was called the Protestant establishment in those times, and Sydney wasn't. Sydney was really dominated by working-class Labor men who'd joined the Labor Party and become prominent in government at the New South Wales level when state governments were more important then perhaps than they are now. So I think that's the combination of factors. And then, of course, Daniel Mannix coming along and, asserting himself, because Daniel Mannix's position was that the Santamaria always repeated. When I knew him, the Catholics were not determined not to be what he called hewers of wood and drawers of water. They were going to be important in the community. So when you've got someone like Mannix standing up, it's pretty obvious that someone is going to take pot shots at him, as he did. And, of course, Mannix made some mistakes. On reflection, I don't agree with his position about conscription in the First World War, and he was a controversial figure, but on the other hand, he was a great tribal leader, so he rallied people around him. So you've got a combination of all those factors, but they prevailed. So in Victoria, for example, Catholics in politics were predominantly in the Labor Party and out of government, whereas Catholics in politics in New South Wales were predominantly in the Labor Party and in government.
You mentioned before B.A. Santamaria going to Melbourne University, studying arts and law, and of course taking part in this debate on the Spanish Civil War in 1937. I mean, you said it was a prominent debate. I mean, it was incredible. There were 1,000 people who attended this debate. This was no small debate. This wasn't, just 100 people in a hall somewhere or a lecture theatre. Can you tell me about how important that debate was at the time and, of course, the role B.A. Santamaria played in that debate?
Well, it was held in the Public Lecture Theatre, which I think is a bigger theatre then than it is now. Well, it was so important that Manning Clark, in one of his histories later on in the 80s, I think, he wrote about it, and he wrote about it very vividly. And his vivid reporting was not spoiled by the fact that he wasn't there. Manning Clark, he wrote about Kristallnacht in Germany, and we found out later that he wasn't there. His wife was there, and he was in London. She was in Germany, and she reported the burning of the synagogues, but he claimed that he was there and he wasn't. And when I went through all this, and I went back through Clark's papers, because some of the reports he came up with, some of the expressions he used were never been reported anywhere. Because it was reported in the Melbourne Age, the Argus, it was reported in Farrago, the student newspaper. So I came to the conclusion that Clark wasn't there, but many people were, and it was reported at the time. Well, what it really was in those days was a battle between, because the Spanish Civil War was a complicated affair, but insofar as it reflected itself in the West, it was very much a battle between the Catholics and the communists, because the government in Spain was mainly an anarchist government, but it was persecuting and murdering nuns and priests, and the Catholics objected to that. And the communists supported the Republican regime, and the Catholics supported Franco and the nationalists. So it was a pretty big division. If you look at how Manny Clark reported it, a debate between Lenin and the Pope is how he kind of reported it. And there was a degree of truth in that. But Santamaria was a brilliant polemicist. I mean, one of Australia's greatest polemicists. And he was one of three on one side. There were three on the other side, including one woman. The Catholics stacked the audience, and when they took a vote, the side opposing the Republican government, who were in effect supporting Franco, General Franco, although they weren't great fans of Franco, but that was what the dispute was between. They won the debate, but the debate was determined on the votes. But it was an example of Santamaria's first involvement in opposition to communism, because he and others were there predominantly because they were opposing what they thought would become a communist regime in Madrid. And it's a controversial matter, and I have explained it in my book, and Santamaria, a most unusual man. And I mean, I think that's what would have happened. But in the end, Franco prevailed. Franco ran a very oppressive military dictatorship. In my view, it wasn't a fascist dictatorship because he didn't have a fascist ideology, but it was a very unpleasant authoritarian military dictatorship. Had the other side won in the Spanish Civil War, it probably would have been an even more oppressive communist dictatorship. But insofar as it had an impact in Australia, Santamaria, as quite a young man, led that debate along with two others. At the end of it, it was reported widely that Santamaria called out, "Long live Christ the King," which was the cry of the Catholics in the Spanish Civil War. And he never denied it, but he never said he did it. But in fact, it was another guy called Stan Ingwersen who yelled it out. When it was put to Santamaria that he called it out, he never said no, he didn't, but he never said yes, he did. But in fact, he didn't. But Bob was a bit like that. He was a polemicist, and I mean, it would have been a nice thing to have called out, especially if you win the debate, but I think it wasn't him. Right. But he was a brilliant debater. And we'll come back to this, no doubt, but I pointed out, because the cover of my book's got a photograph of Santamaria at the Channel 9 studio when he did his point of view broadcast, which he pre-recorded on a Thursday for release on Sunday. But he could talk to a camera for 7 minutes direct without a script, without an order cue, and with a few notes in front of him. Now, I know some people who can do it, but it's a very, very rare skill. I think Bill Clinton could do it, for example. So he was a brilliant polemicist. He could talk, he could memorize a speech and deliver it for 50 minutes with very few changes in the words. So very few people can do that. So you can understand why he would have been the star performer, although Stan Ingwersen, who was with him on his side of the debate, was also a performer because he'd at various times dressed up as a European count and travelled around Australia and been praised as some kind of prince. So he was another bullshit artist. I mean, there was, they were a young man having fun, I guess, for a serious cause.
Yeah. I mean, at this time, B.A. Santamaria was 22, if my math is correct, 1937.
Yep.
His political beliefs, were very strongly held, but they were still developing. But you could absolutely tell that he was going to be a staunch anti-communist. But can you give me a broader characterisation of his political beliefs? And I guess they've come out of that strong Catholic educational background and the influence of Mannix as well on him, which was no doubt very strong.
Ironically, he was a strong environmentalist. He wrote, his first book was called The Earth, Our Mother, which probably these days would be written by someone like Bob Brown. He was a strong environmentalist.
But so was Margaret Thatcher. She was a strong environmentalist. The environmentalism hasn't always been a cause célèbre of the hard left, has it? It has a conservative grounding in it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's part of being conservative. So Santamaria was very much influenced by Catholic social doctrine of the time, Divini Redemptoris, which was the Pope, and Quadragesimo Anno, which was the Pope stressing that greater resources should go what would then have been called the working class and fewer resources to business. The Popes were never very much in favour of business. They were very much in favour of the workers. And so Santamaria came up in that kind of social Catholic action concept of social justice, which prevailed through most of his career. He was a Labour man of one kind or another for most of his life. He was very much concerned about workers' rights, particularly in his young days. So in his young days, he's interested in the environment, but also he's interested in justice for the working class. So initially there was put to him he might get pre-selection, a Labor seat in Melbourne, which he didn't do, and he may or may not have got pre-selection, but he may have. But he had an opportunity to do that around 1940 and didn't do it. So his background in those days was very much kind of what we'd now call right-wing Labor, but with an emphasis on social justice, but driven above all by anti-communism. And the anti-communism is not really surprising because his anti-communism turned on how he saw the situation in Spain, but the communist regime in Russia that became the Soviet Union was profoundly anti-religious. So all the religions, whether it was the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Christian Church or the Jewish faith or whatever, in the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin were persecuted. So it's not surprising that someone like Santamaria becomes an anti-communist. And I deal with this in the book. I mean, there is this allegation that Santamaria was some kind of fascist, which was never true, and for various reasons. And one of the reasons was, if you look at Italy at the time, in the 1930s in Italy, or in Germany, let's say in both Italy and Germany, the Catholic Church, insofar as I want to get the young men and women on side, the rivals of the Catholic Church were the fascist regime in Italy and the communist regime in Moscow, because they were trying to get the same kind of people. So, and in fact, this is often forgotten. I once mentioned this to Barry Cassidy, the ABC TV guy, that the Pope in the late 1930s had issued an encyclical against Nazi Germany, and Cassidy thought I was making it up, but I wasn't making it up. So the Catholic Church opposed fascism and it opposed Nazism, and the latter time in an encyclical that was actually published in German and read from the pulpits by parish priests in Germany at the time. So Santamaria never went near fascism or Nazism, but he was profoundly anti-communist, and I think for good reason. And the one consistent thread through his entire life is his anti-communism. Some of the other matters he changed on, as most people do, not dramatically. His positions were pretty consistent, but his position on opposition to communism, he sort of inherited, was sort of born with it, and he took it to his grave.
But what about his views on property ownership? He had this support for distributivism, that sort of idea that widespread property ownership would give people the economic security to focus on their family and matters of faith. How did that fit?
Well, the distributive movement predominantly in Britain, and Santamaria got on the edge of this. It was popularised by people like Chesterton, to some extent Belloc, Belloc was born a Catholic. Chesterton was a convert from Anglicanism. And the general idea was that all government would be moved as far from the centre as possible, so it would be distributed down. It was a theory of the kind of policy of the Catholic Church, but of course the Church never practiced it because the Vatican was kind of an elected monarchy. It wasn't anything like a distributive state. I don't think Santamaria took all that much notice of distributism. I don't think he read Belloc or Chesterton. He was very much a practical man, but insofar as it manifested itself, what he did favour, and your direction here is correct, he favoured small landholding. He wanted a situation where ideally you would have a lot of people, I mean, some people would live in the cities, but a lot of people would live on self-subsistence farms. Men and women would live there, they would have children, the children would go to local schools, they would produce a lot of their own food, and he tried to get that established. So it was a kind of manifestation of distributism, but not so much about power, but about how people lived. Of course, he lived in these cities all his life, but he established a national Catholic rural movement, which was devoted to that. And his second engagement with Robert Menzies was that he wanted a land settlement scheme set up whereby the federal government and the state governments would assist migrants to set up on small farms. It was never going to work because we'd been through closer settlement during the First World War with the soldier settlement scheme, and after the Second World War with the soldier settlement scheme. And some of them worked. Like Jack McEwen became the Country Party leader. He came from a soldier settlement farm, and I think John Gordon did too. But by and large, they didn't work. I mean, they were too small. They didn't work. But Santamaria wanted them to work. And eventually he, in the early 50s, when Menzies is Prime Minister, he writes to Menzies about this proposition and gets a knockback. As Menzies has said, effectively, it won't work. And on that, Menzies was correct. So Santamaria in those kind of areas was a bit of a dreamer, but a well-motivated dreamer. But when people looked at a closer settlement, they realised that our experience from the 1920s and again from late 1940s wasn't going to work, and it didn't work. No. By and large, it didn't work.
And it didn't.
So that didn't prevail, but he did try on that. So he was interested in these smaller units. He favoured very much home ownership. He favoured smaller units. He supported unionism because he thought people should be in unions because their pay would probably be better than if they weren't. So he was sort of a social democrat. He wasn't a socialist, but he was a social democrat.
It's interesting to reflect on what he would think of how urbanised Australian society is these days. He was idealising a rural life and how that would provide people with the space to focus on family and faith. And is it 98% of Australians live in major cities? It's incredible how urban we are.
I used to remind Bob, I was a bit irreverent in those days. And I used to remind him that, I used to remind him at the time that he did live in Kew. He hadn't milked many cows when I knew him, I'll tell you that. But he thought other people should, and others did too. I mean, a couple of people went off and lived the life, and he didn't do that. And he spoke about, there were a couple of people, there was a Catholic settlement at Merrinol, I think, it's on your way to Gippsland, and there was a small rural settlement there where people tried to live the distributist life, but Bob said he didn't want to join it, and he didn't join it because I think there were better things to do. But he had that option, but he didn't take it, and there you go.
Tell me, Gerard, about the founding of the movement, and this is where we do get some inconsistent accounts. It's obviously incredibly important in the political history and the trends and voting patterns it generates, but tell me about how this all came to be.
Well, it's highly complicated, so I'll try and explain it. In my book, I didn't write a chronological history of my biography of Santamaria because his life was so complicated and he joined and moved in so many organisations, predominantly Catholic ones. It was very difficult. So I wrote a chapter on Santamaria and the Liberals. I wrote a chapter on Santamaria and Labor. I mean, I broke it up that way because I couldn't do it chronologically. So if you go back to Santamaria and the movement, well, he initially starts off heading an organisation called Australian National Secretariat of Catholic Action, which Mannix asked him to do, and he sets that up in around 1937. And that's supposed to be looking at Catholic action. It's supposed to be getting groups of young men and young women together in various organisations like the Young Christian Workers and the Young Christian Women, I think, a name like that. And there were various names. And that was supposed to sort of do good work. And that goes for a while. But Santamaria found that a bit frustrating because he couldn't see how it was actually achieving anything. There was a guy there called Frank Marr who was number one. Santamaria was number two. And Frank, who I got to know later on, he ended up a law lecturer at Melbourne University. But Frank was a bit of a dreamer. He wasn't a practical man. I think Santamaria got frustrated by that. But at any rate, move it on. So that's going. And then his story is this, that in the 1940s, early 1940s, the communists are becoming very strong, particularly in the Australian Union movement. And he is asked by a guy called Crimean, who was a Labor man in the Victorian Labor Party, to help set up a group of anti-communists to take on the communists in the trade union movement. And that then, he starts off, that becomes the movement. Now, that was initially called the movement, and then the Catholic Church decided to fund it, largely, and that became the Catholic Social Studies movement, which is what we call the movement. So you had this group called Catholic Action, which is supposed to look at just matters of what the Catholic young men and women are doing and advancing Catholic causes, and the movement, which is directed against communism. And Santamaria is running both at the one time. So he'd go into one office in Melbourne in the morning and then he'd walk down the other office for the afternoon, and he claimed that these organisations were separate. And he got away with it for a long time. But eventually the Catholic bishops who were supporting Catholic Action got a bit wary of it, and they closed that down around 1954. But the movement starts off, and again, I'm a bit suspicious of this because Santamaria puts down the first date of the movement as, he varied the dates between 1941 and 1942, but the actual day of the month was the 14th of August. And I became a bit suspicious of that date because it happens to be the date of his birthday.
All right.
I think he just made that up. I mean, in a way, it didn't really start. It sort of just started and it happened. And when people look back on it, they didn't know when the movement started. And that's why in Santamaria's books, he gives different years for the movement. But by 1945, it becomes solidified because by 1945, the movement now is supported by the Catholic hierarchy. And there are three bishops who are supposed to supervise it. But of course, as with the other organisation, the Catholic Action one and the movement, Santamaria put himself in the position where he was doing all the work. So he would prepare the agenda of what was going to be discussed, and then he would write the minutes about what was discussed. So effectively he controlled, because if you're in an organisation, you set the agenda and you write the minutes, you're pretty well running it.
Yeah. And
they had a body of three, but there were always divisions in the Catholic Church in those times as now. And so the body of three of bishops who were supervising the movement set up in 1945 officially with a fair bit of Catholic money. was Archbishop Norman Gilroy of Sydney, then an archbishop, later became cardinal, Archbishop Daniel Mannix in Melbourne, and Bishop O'Collins from Ballarat. He said to O'Collins, I'm not going to any of these meetings. In fact, they'd never met pretty well.
Yeah.
But
Didn't
he said,
need to.
If you have
if Santamaria was writing the agenda and writing the minutes.
Yeah. Mannix never interfered. So what Gilroy said to O'Collins, look, I'm not going to the meetings, Bishop O'Collins, but if you're in a disagreement with Archbishop Mannix, I'm voting with you. So he was going to vote against Mannix, whatever the issue was, but O'Collins was never in disagreement with Mannix, and Mannix was never in a disagreement with Santamaria. So Santamaria is running it. So what you have is, this group is very effective because it wasn't only a Catholic group. The movement was a Catholic group, but they linked in with what we call the industrial groups that had been set up in the Labor Party for a similar reason, because there were a lot of very strong anti-communists who were not Catholics.
Yeah.
A lot of them were like Laurie Short, and there were Protestants and there were others. But because the Catholic Church in those days operated out of the parish system, you had all these men going to church on Sunday with their wives and children. You had a parish priest who was linked in to, say, in Melbourne, to a very follower of Daniel Mannix. And it was easy to recruit men because the parish priest would ask a group of men to go around and meet with Santamaria's people after Mass or something, and they could get most of these guys, like my father was in the Clerks Union. They were members of the Clerks Union. They would turn up at meetings and they would vote out communist leadership and vote in anti-communist leadership. And that's what happened. And so in that period, between around 41, I'd say, and there's probably a bit of it there in 1940 when Santamaria is starting this. So in that period between the early 1940s and the late 1940s, the dominant role of the Communist Party and the Australian trade union movement, which affects the Australian Labor Party because there are so many people from the trade union movement voting in the Labor Party National Conference and National Executive, that the communists are effectively driven out in many of the unions, and they're replaced by anti-communist, many of whom are Catholics, but not all of whom are Catholics. So it's a huge change.
Was it controversial that the Catholic Church was getting so involved into trade union politics?
Well, none of this was known until 1954.
I see.
When what happened in 1954, just so I mentioned that the Catholic organisation, Catholic Action, had broken down in 54, so did the movement. So it split. And it split really a bit before the Labor Party split in 1955. And what happened was it became an issue, and there was a real argument here. I can see the validity of the argument. I mean, by, say, 1952, the communists had been greatly diminished in the trade union movement. And then the issue was, what do you do with Santamaria's anti-communist movement? And I think the Sydney people, Cardinal Gilroy, in an area where you had a Labor government, I think he wanted to close it down, discontinue support. He was supported by a guy called Bishop Carroll. Santamaria wanted to continue it because he thought he could bring about other reforms. I go through this in my book. Social reforms and other reforms that he thought were important as well. So the Catholic Church splits over Santamaria's role for the second time in about 5 years. And around this time, the Labor Party splits. So the Catholic Church's role in the movement splits a little bit before the Labor Party splits. They come in together. And then at that stage, it's leaked out what has been happening. And, of course, there's still a degree of anti-Catholic sectarianism around. And so Santamaria, for the first time, becomes a public figure around 1954. But when the story about him first broke, Douglas Pringle, who was the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald at the time, went looking for a photograph of Santamaria, and no one could find one. Although his career was interesting because as a young man in 1939, with Robert Menzies and some Labor guys, the Victorian Premier, he addressed an organisation calling for peace in Melbourne. He appears with Bert Evatt, the Labor Party leader of the Catholic Life Movement, big conference in Melbourne. That's in 1953. He appears with Evatt. So he did know some of these people, but no one much knew him. And so when the issue broke in the mid-1950s, Santamaria becomes known. But what happens then is that Santamaria always said he never voted Liberal all his life, and I think that's pretty true. So you're now in a situation, you're looking in the 1950s, the movement's beginning to break up in 1954. Now, Menzies wins in 49, comes to office for the second time. He wins again in an early election in 51. There's an election due in 54. The election due in 54 coincides with the Royal Tour, which takes about 8 weeks in the lead up to the 54 election. The Queen was here for an extraordinarily long time, and her husband,
days,
but also,
yes.
and also the economy was recovering. There'd been a sort of an economic downturn, we'd probably call it a recession in 1951, but the economy was recovering. Evatt was the leader of the Labor Party, was his first election. for Menzies as leader of the Liberal Party was his third election. And what happened was that Menzies, as you know, narrowly won. He probably got a minority of votes, probably, but he won a majority of seats, and Evatt lost. Now, the prime reason why Evatt lost, I think, was because the economy was improving from 1951, and Evatt had ran a disastrous campaign by making promises that he couldn't possibly fund. And there was criticism from within the Labor Party by anti-communists about Evatt's economic policies. Now, when Evatt lost in 54, he then blamed the Victorian branch, and Evatt moved against the Victorian branch and expelled them. They were expelled in 55. My father was a branch member. So they all went off and joined effectively what became the Democratic Labor Party. But Evatt looked around for someone to blame, and he blamed Santamaria and Mannix, and that accentuated the Labor split. So that's how that came about. Evatt goes on to lose again in 58 and his third election loss in a row. He loses 54, 55 and 58. And so at that stage, Santamaria is a public figure. Soon after, the split takes place, and the breakaway Labor group, who some people say they resigned, but effectively they were expelled in Victoria in 55. They joined the Australian Labor Party brackets anti-communist, which becomes the Democratic Labor Party later on. The Democratic Labor Party is only really strong in Victoria and in Queensland, where Labor split in 1957, but it's got support in some of the other states. But in Victoria, it has a big impact for a long time. So by that stage, Santamaria is known to be an active anti-communist operator. He closes down what was originally called the Catholic Social Studies movement and turns it into the National Civic Council. And he begins as a broadcaster soon after, and later on as a columnist, and becomes a kind of public figure, and a very well-known public figure. But for the first 40 years of his life, he was not known at all as a public figure, although he was influential around policy, but not in the public domain. So by 1955, Labor split, and it's a different political world.
Gerard, you mentioned in the 40s Santamaria standing at an event with Menzies and others. How was his relationship with Menzies through that period prior to the Labor split? Did they have much to do with each other, do we know?
No, they didn't. He was there in the 1939 event in Peace Conference in Melbourne because he was representative of Australian National Catholic Secretariat of Catholic Action. So he was there in that capacity, and Daniel Mannix was on the platform, Robert Menzies was on the platform, and the Victorian Labor Party opposition leader was on the platform. So he would have said hello to Menzies then. I think his next communication with Menzies was in the early 1950s when he tried to get support for his idea of self-sufficient farming, which he had to do through the various state governments, but he also wanted Commonwealth government assistance for that, and Menzies knocked it back. And Menzies, as I point out in my book, and I quote Bill Anderson, who was a well-known Melbourne Liberal guy. There are a lot of people named Anderson. I think his name was John, but they called him Bill. And he told me that he was a very fine man, a very good man, a very important supporter of the Victorian Liberal Party. He told me that he tried on occasions to get Menzies to talk to Santamaria, and Menzies didn't want to do so. I think Menzies didn't want to get caught up in the kind of Catholic action stuff. So Santamaria had nothing to do with Menzies through that period until Menzies died. What was important, however, was the impact he had on Menzies, and Menzies was aware of this. Santamaria maintains that without the DLP preferences, because people like my father who had voted Labor, and my father didn't much like the Liberal Party. In fact, my father said about Menzies when I was a young boy, that Robert Menzies, he said, I could vomit him out of my mouth, that's what he said, which was a bit harsh, I think. But I don't exaggerate, and it was true. But come 1955, my father votes DLP, and he gives his first preference to the Liberal Party.
Right. And he does that with full knowledge of the electoral consequences.
It was done deliberately. With the DLP, well, let's call it the DLP. It became the DLP within a few years. I remember it well because in 1954, I like to think I helped my father hand out ALP pamphlets and letterboxes. By 1955, I was handing out DLP pamphlets and letterboxes around Kooyong where we lived. We lived in Balwyn, not far from where Menzies lived for a while before he became Prime Minister. So it was done consciously because you had these mainly Catholics. Not all the DLP people were Catholics, but 90% of them were. And you had people in parishes, and people like my father would go out and say to people, look, I know you don't like Evatt and the Labor Party, he said, but the best way to do it is you vote, and you want Menzies, but he said the best way to do it is you vote DLP, used to vote for Labor, don't vote for the Liberals, vote DLP and give your preference to the Liberals because it's the same vote. It just transfers. So when the DLP people voted, they were very conscious of the fact that their preferences would go to the Liberals ahead of Labor. Now, Santamaria maintains, and he could be right, that those preferences got Menzies across the line in 1958 when he won. That's probably true. It's certainly true that the DLP preferences saved Menzies' government in 61.
Yeah.
That is certainly true. And it's certainly true because the DLP was still strong in Victoria, that the DLP preferences saved John Gorton in 69 because Labor did very well outside of Victoria in 69 and couldn't win a seat in Victoria in 69. So the Democratic Labor Party preferences consciously going to the Liberal Party ahead of the Labor Party, although a lot of people like my father had voted Labor before the split and they didn't like the Liberals much, but they did that. And then, of course, in 1963, because of Santamaria's influence, he had influence through, he didn't talk to Menzies, but he spoke to people like Harold Holt and Casey. So he knew people in the government. But in 1963, Menzies decided that he'd nearly lost in 61, and he brought about a situation where for the first time that the Commonwealth government decided to fund science blocks in all the schools, including Catholic schools. And it was the first time that government aid had been given to the Catholic and the independent system. And that made a huge difference. Now, people like John Howard had an influence on that, although he was a young man in New South Wales at the time. From that occasion, that was the gesture that Menzies made. And Santamaria was involved in negotiations with the Liberal Party at a high level at that time. And from the time Mannix arrived in Melbourne in 1913, Archbishop in 1917, his prime aim was to get Commonwealth and state grants to the Catholic school system, along with other schools like the Lutheran schools, and there were a few other schools like that as well. And eventually that prevailed. So what you had is a great movement. And then by 1963, the Liberals do very well in New South Wales because a lot of people who had been Labor in New South Wales move across to the Liberals and support Menzies in 63. I was just talking with John Howard the other night. And so you've got this gradual change over time.
And people like your father, for example, Gerard, who said that he could vomit out Robert Menzies, he loathed him so much. When that decision was taken in 63, did that change his view of Menzies, do you think?
Oh, yeah, it did. And, I mean, in fairness, my father didn't know. I mean, my mother would have voted the same way, but she didn't talk much about politics. She was a musician. She didn't talk much about politics at home, but it was a gesture because there was a genuine feeling in Melbourne that the Protestant establishment was called wasn't very friendly to Catholics, and that was true. Once Menzies made that breakthrough in 63, and Menzies was no sectarian himself. Well, we know he was a very tolerant man. But there was a view about the Liberal Party. When that gesture changed, the whole attitude changed. And then in 1967, for somewhat similar reasons, Henry Bolte's Victorian Liberal government decides to give individual grants to students, which the state government could do in 67 in the 67 election, because the DLP, under the influence of Santamaria, had threatened the Liberals that if they didn't give some gesture to state aid to the Catholic schools, that the DLP would give its preferences to the Country Party, now called the National Party, over the Liberal Party. And as you know, there was a lot of rivalry between the Country Party and the Liberal Party in Victoria. And Bolte then said, OK, so 63 Menzies at the federal level, 67 Bolte at the state level, and that changed a lot of attitudes. So by the time my father dies in the early 1970s, he's very keen that the Liberal Party win elections.
There you go.
And any of that stuff.
Transformation.
But it shows how clever Menzies was. Yeah.
I guess that leads me to my closing question, Gerard, is today, what is that legacy of Santamaria on politics? This sort of left-right divide when it comes to Catholic vote, for example, or the Labor right, where that sits insofar as you have those kind of communist elements still in the Labor Party, but you certainly have very left-leaning, sort of more socialistic elements in the Labor Party, and of course the Greens in there. If you kind of think of the Greens as the perhaps the hard left of the Labor Party that split off and formed its own political movement.
Well, before I come to that, I should conclude with Menzies, because after Menzies steps down in 1966, he becomes a bit disillusioned with the Liberal Party, not with Malcolm Fraser, but with Gorton and McMahon and Billy Snedden. And Menzies and Santamaria finally made contact. Fraser was always very supportive of Menzies. A lot of Liberals weren't in the early 70s. And Menzies puts out a message that he'd like to meet Santamaria, and they're introduced, and Bob Santamaria would go around to his house. By then he'd moved to Malvern with a bottle of whiskey and talk about things. He would go there about every 3 weeks and quote Paddy Menzies in the book as saying that Bob Menzies really much enjoyed it because they used to talk together about all the people they didn't like, many of whom were in the Liberal Party, most of whom were in the Labor Party. And so towards the end of his life, and Menzies made a contribution to Bob Santamaria's News Weekly magazine and said he expressed the most profound thoughts of any commentator in Australia. So they end up besties. But Bob Santamaria was always much more likely to get on with Liberal Party leaders when they're in opposition. I mean, he got on well with Fraser in opposition. He got on well with Howard in opposition. He got on well with Menzies when he was in retirement. But Santamaria was always critical of governments, whatever they were. He was critical of Labor governments. He was critical of Liberal governments. He was pretty critical of everyone, actually. So that was just his nature. But in the end, he and Menzies got on very well and got through a bit of scotch. And a young kid got coverage in the Melbourne Herald, I think it was, the evening newspaper, because he reported to a journalist that he'd seen Bob Santamaria going into Menzies' home carrying something under his arm. So this got out and got reported. Insofar as Santamaria's legacy, look, he's had an influence. I mean, people like, well, I didn't speak to Santamaria for the last 30 years of his life. But I mean, I was influenced by him. So was Tony Abbott. So was Greg Sheridan. So, I mean, there were quite a few people. I don't think he's had much. He was never a member of the DLP either, but he was influential in the DLP. He presided over a situation where a lot of people who had come from working class Catholic families moved across to vote for the coalition parties. That's true. Subsequently, some of them went back the other way, or their children or grandchildren did. So it's not, the divide's nothing like it was. I don't think he's had a great influence on contemporary politics apart from presiding over that kind of movement, except for the fact that he was proved correct on communism. And it wasn't so long ago that, I mean, when I was at university in the 60s and 70s, people were still speaking well about communist regimes in Vietnam and China, even in the Soviet Union into the 80s. So Santamaria was proved correct on that, and I think that's probably his last legacy. He played a role within the Catholic Church in supporting traditional Catholic values, but that's outside of politics. So he had an influence. But I think above all, he probably had an influence on defence and foreign policy because he was forever talking about, I mean, these days you hear people like Hugh White saying, you know, we can't rely on the United States, we've got to be independent or else just pal up with China. I think that's a fair summary of what he's saying. Santamaria never turned away from the American alliance, but he always said we couldn't rely on it. So his arguments for self-sufficiency and defence, and he was concerned about the Soviet Union, as Malcolm Fraser was, and Menzies had been, but Fraser wasn't very concerned about China. Santamaria was always concerned about the Soviet Union and China and communism in the region. And I think that's held up well, because if you look at what Santamaria wrote in his book, The Defence of Australia, which was published in 1970, and you look at the current debate about China now, what Santamaria was saying in 1970 makes a lot of sense today. So I think his influence has been on anti-communism, foreign policy and defence. I think he would say that most of the social causes he advocated didn't prevail. He became a bit disillusioned with the mainstream or the majority view in the Catholic Church on matters, and he died fairly disillusioned with life, but he was always a bit disillusioned. And I'll finish on this. I was the only person in the movement at the time, and I was there for 10 years, 65 to 75, who had the same level of education as Bob did. And I sort of knew that a lot of the books he was quoted, he hadn't read, and a lot of the quotes he was saying he was just making up. And occasionally I would tell him that, which he wasn't particularly pleased about, but I think he found it difficult. I don't know why, but I once said that because it was always so dark, it was always so gloomy, intellectually gloomy, and we're all going to lose and all that. And at one of the conferences, I said that I looked around the room and I said, I divide up the people in the movement. I said, well, we still called it the movement. It was then called the National Civic Council officially. I said, we've got the optimists and the pessimists, and the optimists and the pessimists say we're all completely doomed. We're all absolutely doomed. And the optimists would say, well, we're not really doomed. We just have another general depression or a third world war, everything will be okay. So that didn't go down very well. But it was a bit like that. It was all sort of doom and gloom. And so Santamaria, living in that kind of environment, he was never going to be really happy with any government. And he wasn't happy with any government, but he did influence quite a few of them, and particularly the government of Robert Menzies.
Oh, well, and in that respect, he had a huge influence on the shape of Australian politics for many decades. Well, Gerard Henderson, thank you so much for such a fascinating discussion on B.A. Santamaria. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners will too. I really appreciate the time you've taken to talk to me today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.